Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm back with another video. It's Wednesday, about noontime here on March 11th, 2026. And I want to talk about Operation Epic Fury and how it turned into Operation Epic F Up. F meaning the four-letter word that is not a nice, polite word to say, but it looks like that's what we're dealing with here. I also subtitle this When Imperialist Arrogance Meets Reality. And I also want to point out that what we're seeing here is not just an isolated incident of this Iranian war, the attack by the United States on Iran, but I want to place it in historical context because what we're dealing with here is a 500 or even perhaps even 1,000-year war of Western countries, Western so-called civilization against the rest of the world. So I want to begin with a speech by Joseph Goebbels. And Joseph Goebbels was the chief propagandist for the Nazi regime in the 1930s and 1940s. And in 1943, he gave a speech to a dedicated audience of these are like the hardcore Nazis. And he was talking about total war as a short war. He was addressing the fact that the battle for Stalingrad had failed. And he was openly admitting that it failed and that there was going to be a very difficult road ahead that Germany needed to mobilize in order to face this threat of the imminent Soviet victory in Stalingrad and the implications of it. So basically what he was saying was that he thought that, Germany thought, and Hitler even said, at the beginning of the attack, the unprovoked attack on the Soviet Union, by the way, that was a truly unprovoked attack. However, it was an attack that was not, it was not like the Soviet Union didn't know it was coming. It just didn't know when. So, but it did happen, and it resulted in, catastrophe for the Soviet Union, which it recovered from. But Hitler said something like, the Soviet Union is just like, he said it's something like it's a house of cards and just one kick and the whole thing will fall down. This reminds me of something that Donald Trump said regarding Iran, that he thought that, just one kick and the house of cards of Iran would fall down. So there's a parallel there. There's another parallel, which is that in Stalingrad, this was a city on a major river, but it was the Volga River. However, it was a transit point for goods that flowed from North Soviet Union to the Southern Soviet Union, and Southern Soviet Union, the oil from the Southern Soviet Union flowed up to Northern Soviet Union, where it was needed for their energy. Well, it turns out that it didn't work. The Stalingrad fell to the Soviets. They managed to defeat their German opponents because, unbeknownst to the Germans, the Soviet people had a lot of determination not to be defeated by Germany, but also because they had furiously built up a very serious industrial base and military industrial complex. And that was basically what happened. Germany thought they were going to fight a quick in and out war, not so much out, but quick in and take over of the Soviet Union. And the United States thought it was going to make a quick takeover of Iran. And both of these wars have ended up as attrition wars. And the outcome of it is certainly, in the case of Germany, it was a disaster for Germany, at least that regime. And they lost. It was just terrible catastrophe for the German people. Maybe not as bad as it was for the Russians, but it was still very, very bad. But here we are in the current battle of the United States versus Iran, and this what is so, to me, what's so striking about this is that the forces that we're dealing with here are essentially the Western European and now the American forces against Iran, whereas back in the World War II, it was the Western European forces, Germany primarily, but many of the other countries joined the Hitler coalition. So this has been a battle of West versus East, so to speak, for a long, long time. And it's important to point out that even in the novel 1984, George Orwell talks about the fact that the world has always been a war of Oceania versus West versus Eurasia and East Asia. How does that translate out? The war has been a war of NATO and the United States versus Russia, the major Eurasian power, and China, the major East Asian power. So this is the bigger scenario that we're facing nowadays. Now the question is, as I pointed out in his speech, Joseph Goebbels was talking about ultimate victory, but it was going to be quite difficult, and it was going to require real mobilization. And he talked about no more bars and fancy restaurants. People needed to buckle down and get together for this war effort. Anyway, he called for total victory, and he said he called it total war. Now we're really going to fight. That was the point of the speech. Now we're really going to fight. Now Pete Hegseth, is the Secretary of War, and he thought, along with Trump, that it was going to be a pushover, that Iran was going to be a pushover. They would knock out the supreme leader, and the country would fall apart, and it would be another easy win for the U.S. military. But of course, it hasn't turned out that way. Now, Pete Hegseth, unlike Goebbels, is not admitting possible defeat or even any sort of defeat so far. He's saying that we're winning, even though in reality the United States has experienced some very serious losses. So Pete Hegseth is, you might say, even more in denial than even Joseph Goebbels was. But their mindset, which is this, kill, kill, kill mentality, that's common to both of them. That's another parallel that I think we need to take a look at. Now, again, I like to go back into history, and I want to start off by saying here that the victory against Iran is nowhere near certain. And to give a couple of historical examples of that, in the follow-up to World War II, Korea was a country that had been occupied and colonized by the Japanese. When the Japanese were kicked out by a native, nationalist nationalist leader, it was basically, this is a socialist or communist ideology that was ruling their nationalism, and the West really didn't like that for two reasons. One, they don't like communism or socialism of any sort, and secondly, because the United States wanted to get a foothold in Asia, where they could then go on to attack China. And the United States' long-term plan is also to attack China. So even back then, at the end of World War II, we're still fighting China in one way or another. Now, but what happened was that Korea had two very important allies, Russia and China, or the Soviet Union and China. And nowadays, we are here in this war on Iran, and Iran is not falling. It had an initial, close to defeat last June, but it managed to battle back, and the Iranians, were approached by the Russians at least and said, you're in a vulnerable position. Maybe you need some help. And the Iranians kind of said, thanks, but we think we can handle it ourselves. When they actually got attacked back in June, they said to Russia and China, well, I think we could use some help. So here we are in a situation where in the case of the Korean War, who helped Korea withstand American and Western imperialism? It was Russia and China. In the Vietnam War, it was a case of Western imperialism against Vietnam, a small country, but it was backed by Russia and China. So there's this pattern emerging here where Russia and China are acting as, you might say, the anti-hegemons against the Western hegemon. And now Iran is in a position where, with the help of Russia and China, helping them with not just military equipment, but also targeting information, things of that nature. So again, this is another example of Western, attempts at hegemony over Iran. But there's another parallel here, which is that, as I mentioned earlier, Stalingrad was a major port. It was a major city on a river, which facilitated, traffic to transport goods, oil, and other commodities up and down this huge Volga River. But in the case of Iran, Iran is also at a crossroads. Not only is it a pivot point between Russia in the north and India and the Indian Ocean on the south, but it's also right at the center of the, you could say, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's idea of recreating the Silk Road. During the medieval times, China was the great manufacturing country in the world, the most advanced country in the world, and they were pursuing their commercial trade across all of Asia, going from China west to even places like Italy, where Marco Polo decided to follow that Silk Road back to China around the year, I think it was around 1200, and he was shocked at how advanced China was. So, but you see, the West is they've had this kind of fascination with Eurasia because they know that that's where the dominant amount of wealth in the world is, and the amount of people in the world, and they've really been trying to get hold of it, literally for centuries. So, but the same protagonists are still involved. It's the NATO countries, now of course the United States, and against the major countries, Russia and China. However, the United States also, they underestimated, just as they had underestimated the Soviet Union, they underestimated Iran, because Iran is not just a state that just kind of came into being out of thin air. It is a civilizational state. It's got a history going back 3,000 years. So I think that the U.S., just as Germany had underestimated the Soviet Union, and both not just Soviet culture but also Russian culture, the U.S. and the West have underestimated Iran's resolve, and the fact that at a certain point, when Iran had actually been, they had a democracy in 1953. The United States came in and destroyed that democracy, installed the Shah, who was apparently quite a brutal leader. And it took over 20 years to get rid of him. And the people who emerged were the most, the most committed aspect of Iranian society. Iranian society is not monolithic. There are certainly leftist elements in it and progressive elements and secular elements who don't particularly go for the theocratic nature of the current Islamic Republic. But nevertheless, I think they've come to realize with the latest attacks and the latest perfidious attempts at diplomacy, which are not sincere, that has brought the Iranian country, the nation of Iran, which is based on Persian. They have, you could say, the Persian DNA in their veins, in their cells. So that's what's going on there. Let me see. There are other conflicts that have gone on, and very often the difference between success and failure of those countries to survive has been whether Russia and China, or Russia or China, have been willing to stand up for them. So in the case of Venezuela, for example, Venezuela, I thought that Venezuela had a sense of national cohesion, and also that they'd had 30 years to build up military resources. And I personally would have thought that Venezuela could have, shot one of those, battleships that were off the coast, just to say, hey, look, we're here, and we're not going to give up without a fight. But apparently that didn't work, and it would seem that the West, the Americans, bought off enough people in the leadership structure of Venezuela that they were able to, come in and accomplish their quick victory there. Although it remains to be seen how long the people in Venezuela will put up with that. We just don't know. But other countries like Afghanistan, they had some, when Afghanistan was hit by the extremely conservative elements of Afghan society. Remember that Afghanistan actually had a socialist secular government, but the cities were in favor of that government, but the people in the hinterland, so to speak, are far more conservative, religiously conservative. And so the United States always plays on the most conservative or the most rigid or brutal elements of society to tear the society apart, which is exactly what happened with Afghanistan. Afghanistan had a chance in the 1960s and 1970s, but when the U.S. Decided to go in there, it's just been nothing but trouble for that country ever since. So let's see. Yeah, the last thing that I wanted to mention is that in the case of both Russia and China and now Iran, those countries did not have a commitment to a wartime, industrial base. But especially after the Soviet Union fell, the Russian Federation got rid of they cut their military budget by 75%. And China was spending its time building up its economy. And Iran, is under the Shah, it had some military, but not a huge amount. But I think following the fall of the Shah, the Iranian people realized that they really needed to protect themselves. So they built up their education system so they're able to produce high technology products. And also they built up, unbeknownst to the West, a very significant military industrial complex, which could build these missiles, which are much cheaper than, say, a manned aircraft. So the reason why Iran has been able to survive against this attack is because they basically knew back from 1980, roughly, when the current government took over, that the U.S. was coming for them sooner or later, and they were able to prepare for it. And so what the U.S. thought was going to be a quick war is now going to be a war of attrition, just as what happened with Germany in Russia during World War II. So that's basically what I want to talk about here. It's very difficult to say where it will go. It doesn't look so good because there are various forces in these countries that are extremely fanatic, both in the West and in Asia. And fanatics are not very good at negotiations and compromise. So we'll just have to see how that goes. But anyway, I want to thank you for listening to my presentation here. I will be grateful if you'll give it a like or a share. If you can also, you can give it a hug. That's another thing you can do. You can also comment on it. That will help. And of course, you can make a donation here on my Substack channel, or also on Buy Me a Coffee, or even PayPal, which are listed in the description. And one last thing is that you can buy one of my information billboard t-shirts like this, which says "Question Everything." But I have others, and you can go to my store and buy yourself a t-shirt. So thanks again for listening. Oh, and one last thing is that I am planning a trip to Russia. I want to see what is actually going on there right now. And I have some friends and contacts in Russia, so I hope to get some information as to what is really happening there. However, that does cost money, and I'm living on Social Security. I don't have access to big donors and big bucks. So if you'd care to chip in to help me on my trip, that would be very helpful. So thanks again for listening, and I will talk to you soon.